if you went to look at the, antecedents of special operations organizations, you would dynamite the facility, if it was a World War II, type reconnaissance / raid. But we're in this era where it may be that the most important, quote unquote, ammunition in a conflict is data.
The GWOT was dangerous. I mean, we lost a lot of great Americans during the GWOT. It was dangerous. It was combat and it was lethal. But there were a lot of aspects of it that weren't highly complicated because we were able to buy down so much risk by dominating so many of the domains. Now, a lot of these formations that are led by people who knew nothing but the GWOT, right? We're expecting formations to train for a much more lethal battlefield where we will not dominate the domains.
And as far as our people, they're compassionate and they're lethal. But I'd say, our adversaries are pretty lethal too. The one thing that really separates our folks is love. And when you say it like that, people are always kind of taken back, like love. You got to be able to visit violence upon those that deserve it and all that. But no, it's this great warrior love that's defined in between the sound of a 7.62 millimeter projectile breaking the sound barrier. And the only thing that matters is that of which is at your shoulder.
Welcome to the Irregular Warfare Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Jebb, and today we conclude our 4-part Future of War series. This episode is anchored in August Cole's short story, Operation Lightning, which takes us to the mid-2030s and a war between the United States and China. The story we'll unpack follows 2 Army Ranger units operating thousands of miles apart, but whose missions are deeply interconnected. In Antarctica, a small team of Rangers conducts a military freefall infiltration to digitally sabotage a Chinese space station providing targeting data to PLA artillery back in Asia. Meanwhile, in the South China Sea, a Ranger battalion depends on that disruption to seize a contested airfield while avoiding Chinese long-range fires. Together, these 2 operations illustrate a central challenge of future warfare. Small, distributed units will need to master emerging technologies, operate across vast distances and domains, and create opportunities for one another, all while continuing to rely on the grit, trust, and initiative that have always defined combat. To explore what that future demands of our formations and our people, we're joined by the story's author, August Cole, and the command team of U.S. Army Special Operations Command, Lieutenant General Gil Ferguson and Command Sergeant Major David Waldo. At the conclusion of our interview, we'll play a professionally narrated version of Operation Lightning, the anchor for today's conversation. You're listening to the Irregular Warfare Podcast, a joint production of the Princeton Empirical Studies of Conflict Project and the Modern War Institute at West Point, dedicated to bridging the gap between scholars and practitioners to support the community of irregular warfare professionals. Here's our conversation with August Cole, Lieutenant General Gil Ferguson, and Command Sergeant Major David Waldo. Okay, welcome back to the show, August. By now, our listeners are hopefully familiar with your work as an author and futurist, and more importantly, a good friend of the pod. But this is our series finale, and we saved the most compelling story for last, right? So today we'll be looking at how U.S. Army Special Operations Command, or USASOC, prepares its soldiers for large-scale combat across a global theater of operations. But just to start the show, Gil, I was hoping you could explain your role as the commander of USASOC.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. First of all, thanks, August. Ben, thanks for having us here. Looking forward to the conversations today. And we have tuned into the previous episodes, and obviously we know those guys. Mark Schaefer and I go way back, and Pete, and then Jeff Van Antwerp. So a lot of history there, and happy to be part of this, and especially part of the grand finale, so to speak, of the podcast. Yeah, so we were just down at the SOCOM Commanders Conference last week, and we were talking about the life cycle of special operations folks within all of our different formations. And the first slide I threw up on the screen was a totem pole. And the reason I did that is I said, hey, look, this is, USASOC isn't a monolithic formation. USASOC is more like a totem pole. And on the totem pole, the CAG guys had done some great AI work, and it had a bird. So, you got the 160th, we had a bird, a bear, a man, a couple other things. The point is that USASOC is an amalgamation of some very different organizations that really the primary, joint unifying concept of all of them is that they are in the Army and they are special operations elements, right? So, we don't try to pigeonhole the units into one particular type of, operating model or operating concept. And what that means is that at the USASOC headquarters, our primary role, we are a resourcing headquarters. We're not an operational headquarters. We're a resourcing headquarters. And our job is to ensure that all those different, critters on the totem pole, so to speak, have the things that they need to be able to accomplish the tasks that the Army, the Joint Force, the nation expect them to do. And ultimately, what is on DW&I, what is on our mind when it comes to what our formations need to be when they show up at game time is that they have got to show up as combat credible formations.
And for DW, I know you'd like to just wax poetic about your days as a high school football player on the show, but too rarely.
Third string, by the way.
Quarterback.
Politics, and I'm sure this will reach up to Northern Michigan. We can unpack some of that, but
go blue. But too rarely do we get the.
Wow, the whole thing just went sideways. All right. Anyway, go ahead.
We'll get it back on track, but too rarely do we get the senior enlisted perspective on this show, and we're thrilled to have it. So as USASOC's Command Sergeant Major, how would you describe your role, and what should our listeners understand about the people who comprise your organization?
What I love about that question is I've always tried to answer that under the guise, and when you're teaching young people how to communicate effectively through an organization, I always give well, act like you're talking to your aunt or your mom that has a security clearance. How would you describe it? And I've always had such a hard time describing, because I tend to go into, how we talk. We have our own language. Well, I ensure there's understanding up and down echelon, and I find friction, and I can insert myself personally to it, and I make sure everyone has the resources I need, and I'm an enforcer of standards. But our boss's boss actually said it best, and it's General Laniv, the Vice Chief of Staff at the Army, and he was at a pre-command course, and of course he asked the question, hey, where should the Sergeant Major be in a formation? And everyone has one thing about our people, and we love us, we have very strong opinions about things, and everyone had a different opinion. And then finally, they need to be there. They ought to be there. They ought to be here. And well, the answer to that question is, well, they need to be where the organization needs them to be. Our duties are very broad, but you got to insert yourself in the friction to deal personally with that, which affects the credibility or the operational viability of an organization. And then you got to ensure there's understanding, ensure that our folks have all the resources and things they need. And just recently I realized that I'm once again don't walk on the grass, don't take your shirt off during PT, and by God, shave your face and get a haircut guy. It's coming down. We're making sure we're going back to the soul of our Army. And the old man says, hey, wait, make sure you put out a note to the formation. I'm like, oh, damn it, sir. I got to be the beard guy. But I find great joy in that. So it is the standards and discipline thing. And as far as our people, they're compassionate and they're lethal. But I'd say, our adversaries are pretty lethal too. The one thing that really separates our folks is love. And when you say it like that, people are always kind of taken back, like, love, you got to be able to visit violence upon those that deserve it and all that. But no, it's this great warrior love that's defined in between the sound of a 7.62 millimeter projectile breaking the sound barrier. And the only thing that matters is that of which is at your shoulder. And that warrior love is what really separates our folks the most. So that's what you'll find in our formations.
DW, I'm not going to lie, that's powerful stuff. I'm going to bring that forward with me, but for August, I'd like to go from big to small here. So our audience will actually get to listen to a professionally narrated version of your story at the end of this episode, but I was hoping you could briefly summarize Operation Lightning. Why did you write about a small ranger team whose job was to digitally sabotage a Chinese uplift space station in Antarctica to enable their fellow rangers to land on an airstrip halfway across the world in the South China Sea?
Ben, first, it's great to be able to finish up this series with DW and Gil here. This is a real successful, I think, expression of how you can help kind of introduce not just narrative, but new ideas, into the world. So kudos to you for pulling this thing together back when we were talking about it, in the last year or two. Yeah, so this story and the narratives, are part of a larger, collection that we wrote for USASOC. And in this particular story, Operation Lightning, as you said, it takes place in, literally the opposite sides of the world. And you follow in the opening basically a master sergeant who's parachuting in to Antarctica with 3 other rangers as part of a reconnaissance element. And they have to infiltrate a Chinese strategically important base that is a really vital ground station and data uplink center for their constellation that's surveilling the Pacific. The larger theme in this story is this ability for USASOC to see and sense, right? But also to kind of bring access and precision effects, to use the framing that would, I think, define the kind of operation we're talking about. But in the sense of, what is the larger contribution of a 4, person element in the bottom of the planet to the big fight in the Pacific? Well, it's to create access for a Ranger strike force that's going to seize an airfield. And that's a classic, Ranger mission. And we really wanted to unpack this bigger, and it's kind of an existential question in special operations, the relevance and relationship to the larger force. And so from an Army perspective, really thinking about that question of access and effects to understand that, the really critical technologies, particularly the Russians and Chinese have, they all have vulnerabilities on the ground. And the soft space triad, cyber is part of that kind of expression that we've seen talked about over the years. But I think it's really important to think through, what does that actually look like? And so any one of these narratives in this collection, but also this specific story, really try to unpack the kind of what next. So if you're trying to figure out and imagine today, what might a Ranger reconnaissance, team member's role be in the future? You can see a bit of that. What might be the 2 Rangers are arguing about superhero powers, on the back of the C-17 that's going to do this really risky mission. How do they kind of put their mission in context, right? Because they're about to do something extremely dangerous, but is also a historical and traditional mission, right? That kind of legacy. Special operations, the continuity that goes through USASOC. And then figuring out also, if you're looking at this narrative from, big Army, from, the chief's office or from elsewhere in the joint force, how do you kind of begin to kind of make sense of where these pieces should go as you start to imagine, all right, are we, potentially creating any spots that we are not paying enough attention to? Like Antarctica would be one, because there's a lot of, again, strategic importance there, not just for kind of its ability to connect to things in orbit, but also there's a lot of rare earths and other assets. And, look, anywhere where there's not a lot of attention and light is potentially an area that can be exploited by an adversary. And to me, that's a place that's really ripe for like a regular, warfare activity and other kind of engagement. So the story tried to wrap that big, kind of ball together of string and tie it up so that you could, in only a few thousand words, really kind of walk away with a clearer picture of what USASOC can do, not just for the Army, but the joint force in a really strategic way.
I guess what I've loved about your stories is that it's helped me kind of conceptualize, using a very creative medium, very tangible takeaways. But for Gil, the story's narrative flow is pretty cool, right? I mean, you've got a 4-man Ranger team in Antarctica, a blind PLA surveillance network so that a Ranger task force halfway around the world can jump onto an airfield in the South China Sea. That's like 2 hemispheres, multiple domains, 1 synchronized effect. So all fiction aside, how do you think about operating on a global battlefield?
Yeah, what I really like about the scenario and the way the story, and August touched on this already a little bit, what I really like about it is it captures the 2 poles, I guess, so to speak. I guess I just made a pun there since we're talking about Antarctica. Sorry, that was unintended, but it captures the opposite ends of the spectrum that we really have to be concerned with. Okay. And before we got started, we were having a talk about tech and Skynet and where we might be with quantum computing and AI and robots in the next 15, 20 years. But, there are folks out there that think that tech is going to solve the problems of the future. There are folks out there that think that tech is overrated and we really need to just be focused on the basics. And, we can't afford to be adherents to either one of those extreme philosophies. I think our philosophy is that, and what is captured in the story is the importance of the technology. You're making a jump into Antarctica, it's, 180 degrees below zero in the story. If they jumped out at 20,000 feet, it's as cold as you can probably get on planet Earth anywhere, right? So we don't have the technology to do that right now. So there would have to be technology developed. There's things mentioned in there, there's full color night vision goggles. There's advanced navigation tools that they're using while they're in free fall and when they're under canopy. There's thermal suits that they're wearing that we clearly don't have right now, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all this tech that enables them to do what they're supposed to do. But then, they get on the ground, and as will happen in every operation, Murphy will get a vote. And Murphy gets a vote, and I think it's the team leader, if I remember correctly, breaks his arm, And so now you're in a situation where there's nothing the tech can do. So on the one end, you've got all this tech that enables them to do the mission. On the opposite end, you've got what we really have relied on, in the American way of war since, 1775, which is it's the grit, it's the determination, it's the refusal to give up, it's the It's the drive to keep going. We are always going to need that. Now, maybe one day we will have, and I do think one day we will have more robots that are smarter and that are able to do more things for us so that we're only relying on humans to do things that only humans can do, whatever that might be. But in the meantime, the human factor and the baseline core knowledge, skills, attributes that we've recruited, assessed, selected for within special operations forever, right? I mean, forever, we're still going to be relying on those. And so that's really our challenge. How do we blend all of that out of those joint capabilities?
Yeah, the sheer number of things you have to do to master both analog skills and also new digital ones can at times feel overwhelming. I've actually got a question for DW for later, but for August, I did want to ask one thing, right? A main theme kind of underpinning your story is the idea that the special operations community can see and sense farther and faster in that. But I thought it was cool and notable how the Rangers don't destroy the target, Chinese ground station. They quietly corrupt its data instead by adding 10 kilometers to every targeting solution. So why did you choose kind of deception over destruction for your story?
This notion of the ultimate objective in a mission like this, if you went to look at the antecedents of special operations organizations, you would dynamite the facility, if it was a World War II, type reconnaissance / raid. But we're in this era where it may be that the most important, quote unquote, ammunition in a conflict is data. And so being able to interfere with, being able to introduce doubt, the podcast, and I'll plug the IWI Irregular Warfare Podcast right now, Innovation Under Fire, kind of looking at this question of, what is the very innovative, kind of elements of like basically the genesis soft World War II. And one of the takeaways, I think it was Monty Halls, who's a Royal Marine, said this, that you're creating a lot of doubt. You're capturing a lot of bandwidth, cognitively of your enemy leadership. So being able to introduce that friction into the enemies, you can use the OODA loop, and we probably need something more contemporary than that to describe what all this is. But that is maybe far more valuable because if you destroy something that's binary, we were talking about quantum a little earlier where you have like this third superposition idea, like, there's like another element here with uncertainty and doubt that can be incredibly valuable in really degrading not just the actual like tactical or operational level capability, but what's going on back in a Central Military Commission or somewhere in the Kremlin, right? Like to me, that ability to think about this almost cognitive dimension to a very, very audacious small unit action is really important, and so that's part of that. The other is just to change the paradigm in how people think. I'd like to think somewhat of a really important shift in thinking that the job isn't to just break down doors and blow stuff up, but like thinking about this kind of much more nuanced approach to creating an effect that may impact another operation halfway around the world, maybe the only linchpin, right, to pull that off. And I think it also goes to, I'll just say quickly, like risk. There's a lot of friction in and of itself in this story. The Rangers have to get to their just takeoff point, for their aircraft, like the real zigzag path, through South America. And the commander of their unit basically has just disappeared, lost, because, in World War II, that sort of stuff happens. Someone takes off on a plane and they never get there. I think we have to kind of think about those larger dimensions too, and who's comfortable operating in that environment with risk, taking responsibility immediately, even in really kind of unclear situations, and making those decisions, both on the ground as in dealing with the physical adversity, but also that sense of the unknown. There's an exfil plan for these Rangers, but we don't really talk a whole lot about it, for example. But like there's these other, second and third order, considerations that hopefully a story like this can be a thought experiment on.
For Gil and DW, the earlier episodes of this series explored SOF's role in competition and crisis, and this story really completes that arc, with SOF opening the door for the joint force in combat. I'd be curious to hear from both of you, SOF's value proposition in large-scale combat operations, particularly against an adversary's ability to see, sense, and target. And I'll direct that one at Gil first.
The thing that this story does is it helps, as I mentioned, there's the arc of that we talked about already, the kind of the baseline lethality, the hard skills, the hard knowledge skills and attributes, so to speak, that we expect of special operations that are sort of immutable, right? They haven't changed. We still need, hard people to do hard things, right? All the way. And then the other end of the arc is the tech that allows us to make things less hard, right? To work smarter, not harder, so to speak. this story, it does the same thing really with kind of the arc of special operations and what we want to provide to the joint force. And that is the link from pre-combat, into combat. But if you take the previous stories, at any given time within USASOC, depending on what day it is, we've got people, we've got a few thousand people, depending on how many are in the Middle East on any given day, right? We got a few thousand people in about 70 countries around the planet, just rough math, right? And those people have access to partners. They have access to all these different entities, whether they're governmental entities, non-governmental entities, paramilitary entities, et cetera. And so we have an opportunity. I always like to use the example of Market Garden, right? And you had a very well-established Dutch resistance when the 82nd jumped in. And I think it's actually in A Bridge Too Far, maybe. I always get it mixed up, whether it's Band of Brothers or Bridge Too Far. I need to go back and watch them both and clarify. But there's a scene where they link up with someone from the Dutch resistance. And the American commander at the time is a little bit dubious, right? But there's a JED there, or maybe an SOE guy. I think he's supposed to be a JED. He's a British dude who's like, hey, this guy's legit. He really knows what he's talking about. So listen to him. And sure enough, they kind of ops test, I think, some of the information they get, and they realize, no, they know where the Germans are. They know where the Germans have been. They understand what the Germans' defense plans are, et cetera, et cetera. And so really what that means is relieving pressure on the Joint Force Commander. A civil affairs unit that is in country X or region X that has connections with all of these different networks, governmental and non-governmental, is going to be able to communicate that to a Joint Force Commander during combat operations to alleviate pressure on that Joint Force Commander's ability to do, lethal operations.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to everything that the boss just put out is number one, dynamic targeting. It's not popular to say this to GWAP, we fell behind, blah, blah, but we got pretty good at a lot of things during the global war on terrorism, fusing intelligence and being able to shift to time-sensitive targets. You're seeing that play out in real time where SOF is taking the lead on a lot of these things. And then the famous author brought up that you're putting that human in conflict when you're inducing deception. And so you don't even realize there's a problem until you're way past that point. But I'd be remiss if I wasn't able to bring up the wonderful coach Jim Harbaugh. And in this case, he hates the run pass option because you're letting the defense call the shots. You're reacting to the defense, but you're putting the quarterback in conflict. You want to be able to control the offense and put the defender in conflict. We're in SOF, we do both of those, and it depends on what the environment we're in. But that's what I would add.
DW, I do love me some Coach Jim Harbaugh, but I think you might have it backwards, right? The run pass option can create cognitive overload for the defense while enabling the offense to achieve local numerical superiority. I'm a big option guy, but Kyle's going to kill me if I turn this show into a football podcast. So let's go to August. You seem like you've been waiting for me to finish. Go ahead.
I was going to pull that thread about how, Army Special Operations work with local partner forces, local militaries. And, this setting in Antarctica is a really interesting one because it's, one of the most extreme and physical environments you could think about. And the people who are there, right, are very small in number. But there's an analog, obviously, to the Arctic, right? Not just in the environment itself, but you have a really strategic region that has a population that is small, that has been there a very long time, and that understanding how to engage with those communities, I should say, whether it's in Finnmark or, northern Sweden, Finland, Sami people. This is a really, really significant and I think often really overlooked aspect of irregular warfare, in the 21st century. And that you can look at these deserted, so to speak, you'd see it as like an outsider superficially, you'd say that. There's nobody there, but there are people there. And they have, again, much deeper understanding of everything from, which mountain pass is going to be, melting before another for access, or are there, migrations of animals that can cover, movement of people or capabilities. And so, that kind of relationship with those folks who are there, I think, is really crucial. Even more so in the places that aren't, in the kind of core Baltic corridors or, other parts of Europe, or obviously in, throughout throughout parts of Africa too. I think those empty spaces, I mean, we know from, terrorism and the studies of where groups often, seek refuge and, form and train, but also in the big war context, as I see it with Russia and China, those are actually really vital spaces too, because often they're quite strategic. Again, it could be ground in space in Antarctica. It could be, proximity to the Kola Peninsula, in kind of northern Scandinavia. And so being able to really think about what does civil affairs do? What does, a Green Beret A team or, small element of just a couple folks, who are, or just have a long dwell time. You look at some of the work the Norwegians are doing in long distance and long-term reconnaissance missions, that outstrip what most of us would consider wise or feasible, but they're conducting and training and seeing kind of what's possible. That living in those environments over time may be really important, just to understanding when it is really crucial to have access, that it's available, and building that trust. Because, this is like kind of part of that soft truths, we've got a rule set, I guess, that, you really want to be able to understand, can't surge trust is the phrase that people often use, right? So how do you develop that in these really remote areas?
I was just going to follow up a bit, if you don't mind. That August, you got me thinking, the only thing better than a partner is the partner of a partner, right? And we got places all over the planet right now where we don't have access and placement, and our partner doesn't have access and placement, but they've got a partner that does. And we were up in Alaska in February. It was 40 below, and we know we have people that live in the Arctic Circle. Hey man, you can go put on your North Face jacket and walk around in your boots and everything, and you'll be fine, right? Right up until you start fighting in it, right? And it is such an unforgiving environment. We've talked a lot. 10th Special Forces Group is the Army SOF unit that is specifically tasked to possess a high north, extreme cold weather Arctic capability. But the only people that are really going to be really expert at it are the ones that live in it, like the Finns, like the Norwegians, and like some of the folks that you said that actually have lived there for hundreds of years. And so those are all critical relationships. We've got to be, this goes back to that point about us understanding just how difficult it's going to be to fight on a modern battlefield. Take all the tech away. Just fighting, surviving, and winning on a modern battlefield is going to be extremely difficult. So we've got to understand where our role ends, and we're enabling a partner, or we're enabling the partner of a partner to be successful in those kinds of environments, because they just possess the expertise we simply cannot replicate.
Yeah, being in Alaska for a couple of days, we're pretty much experts on the Arctic.
100%.
And I think we're going to get into this in a little bit, but it was fascinating. We're quadruple layered with all the best things, and if something's exposed, it'll freeze off. And we're very careful. But then the Alaskan senator that was with our little party, because of him, I get to travel around fancy people. My man had like a vest on and like a normal shirt. So I'm thinking, okay. But there's a lot of places you got to overfly to provide a lot of support too. And those are those generational partnerships that we're getting to. A lot of times, even at the higher political levels, there's some friction. Typically, there's a mill-to-mill relationship that we can kind of keep the water warm for when we need it. So that's also, it's not as sexy, but that's also just as important. I'd like to add that point, not just the people in the places where they are, but just to get to those places too, we got to maintain those relationships too, which is another, I guess, soft proposition.
Yeah, I mean, as technology continues to advance and we become more reliant on it, kind of a continuing theme throughout this entire series has been precisely that value proposition of being able to navigate and leverage the human terrain that you find yourself in. But August, I do love thinking about technology, and I'd like to survey some of the tech from your story. I mean, you've got full color night vision, autonomously guided cargo pallets, a fur covered drone built to fool machine vision systems, right? Pretty cool. How did you settle on these examples, and how much of this is already real?
The furry drone, is such a great, like, counterintuitive, like if the Terminator crossed with Chewbacca, had some that kind of a look. No, this is, for example, in this case, it's a reconnaissance drone, and it is designed with ducted fans to fly in this really, difficult environment. And, you know how quickly batteries die off in the cold. You have a very limited window, right? So you cannot afford any sort of delays or compromise in getting this piece of equipment as close to its target as possible. But we know too that, the more you see autonomous systems being responsible for situational awareness and surveillance, that, they have underlying data sets and kind of patterns and habits, if you want to call them that, and that more and more attention is going into this sort of adversarial approach or spoofing, especially machine vision. So I was just thinking with Pete about how to, come up with something that would be really, really difficult to, determine was an enemy drone. And, the kind of almost uncategorizable or creating something that looks like, to the machine, another, squall of snow, right? Because you have, for example, maybe a hyperspectral, coating on the fur on the drone. So that the machine doesn't know what it's looking at. I mean, you've seen this over, the last 10 years. It started with, pixel spoofing on stop signs that, would get Teslas to blow through them. And, you can do it even now, as you're watching the war in Ukraine and in Russia, with putting tires on aircraft and stuff like that. And so I think that was an expression of that. Why we, look at these kind of alternative approaches is we want to kind of push the boundary. And, we're lay people basically, right? We're not engineers, but hopefully to inspire. And all these technologies in the story are, on the cusp of being, usable or real. We were looking more and more at how close we're getting to full color, night vision or hyperspectral, imaging that an individual can use. Like that's quite close to being, feasibly produced at scale. The core challenge of keeping a human body alive in really difficult conditions, whether it's, at the bottom of the ocean or whether it's, in the Arctic, is a persistent one. But again, we're making more and more progress on that. And then, ultimately though, when you're thinking about the future, and this is kind of a meta point, I think, from all the way back to Ghost Fleet and Burn-In, those books, but these stories, is that we want to have these rules of the real so that the technologies are anchored in the kinds of realities that we see, right? So that when you're talking about something novel and innovative, like an operating concept or a really audacious mission, and someone would say, oh, that never happened, it's too risky. You can start by building that trust with the person you're, engaging with. In our case, it's a story, it's your reader, so that when you kind of stretch what I think of like an elastic band of like belief or credulity, it doesn't snap. And similarly too, I think to be actually useful, like that's literally the name of, what we're doing, useful fiction. And I think it's really important to kind of do that work and figure out, you can't just hand wave some of these problems away, some of these enduring problems particularly. Again, there are facets to this story. Again, batteries would be a great one to really kind of unpack. If we did this mission, how many pounds of batteries would we need, right? What would those batteries be like? Or if you have someone who becomes, injured or as a casualty, how do you keep them warm, when they're going into shock, like in the middle of the, if it's minus 80. So, these are, I think, hopefully questions that get prompted by reading something like this.
I mean, the scope of technology that it seems like we have to integrate and master feels overwhelming. So from DW, from where you sit, I'd like to get your opinion on what that type of technology means for the force, and more specifically, how are we recruiting and developing soldiers with the skills to operate this sort of advanced kit, ostensibly under possibly severe environmental conditions?
Sure, I love it. But going back a little bit, it was fascinating because, again, we were in Alaska for a couple of days, and so we know everything there is to know about Arctic warfare. When I first heard the old man talk, I see that we get read aheads for this thing, and we got a ranger team that's going to free fall into the Antarctic. I got mad. I got mad at one of my favorite authors. I'm like, this is so dumb. What are we talking about here? But then as you're reading it, you captured everything so well, and to put a little bit of perspective, not just so I'm talking and I do my best work in the superlative, but we have one of our team sergeants was
fact.
He said, hey, they banned chemical warfare. We should ban warfare in the Arctic. And if you think about that really quick, that would be wonderful, but we'd love to be able to choose where we can battle. But as SOF, we don't get that luxury. We got to fight where our nation needs us to fight. And Arctic is one of them. But in the Arctic conditions, it's so fascinating because you first get there. If you move fast, you die. And Austin, you covered that. Your whole way of thinking, if you're in a patrol base and you're getting incoming, you're not blowing out of the patrol base. You got to stay there and hunker down, because if you blow out of the patrol base, you'll die. So all of your instincts almost have to flip. And then the other thing, and I was so amazed during the free fall, my man did a little stretch of his jaw and he got a little bit of that air into the mask, and you captured those little details that gets into, we have all this technology. You still have to have, at the end of the day, you got to be the human to not make those kind of mistakes. The boss and I were on snowmobiles and made that mistake, and we had little burns on our faces for a while. So we can 100% relate to falling from 30,000 feet. And so I guess a long way of saying, number one, the technology is here. We're incorporating, we're modernizing the Q course. We're chasing youngsters in Ranger School with drones to get them used to those kinds of things. But there's also just the human element of good standards, good order and discipline. But a long time ago, when I was running one of our training courses, and this was back when drones, you could get them in like the weird aisle of like JCPenney or Spencer's Gifts next to the weird shirts with the 60s rock band. So new, but this one of these youngsters had this drone and was using it to look at places that he had to go and conduct an activity. And I remember getting his products back and they were phenomenal, but like, you can't do that. Like, I don't think he can do that. Can he do that? I don't think we can. So the mindset, the kids coming in, the young people coming in are there. What you're seeing is a mindset shift with senior leaders and embracing that and I guess supercharging those kind of environmentals.
Yeah, it almost sounds like we have, new soldiers who are digital natives who are kind of changing how senior leaders are thinking. And at the same time, you kind of have an obligation to ensure that they're maintaining kind of the basic skills and grit and resilience.
It wasn't a general that came up with the hedgerow buster.
Point.
It was like an E5 who like took out some scrap metal.
What would we do without NCOs? You ever thought about that? Let's do a podcast on the non-commissioned officer.
Yeah. But that makes your point, Ben. I mean, that was a very low-tech solution, but it was a revolutionary low-tech solution. And so we talk all the time about again, this is the art, right? Helping our subordinate commanders balance the creativity that we want the formation to continue to express creativity, but it can't be art school. You know what I'm saying? It's not, hey, get out there with your paintbrushes and, express yourself. There's got to be a lot of that, but it's got to be rooted in a foundation of the, baseline, knowledge, skills, attributes.
There's another aspect to this story, and I think it ties into some of these kind of bigger concepts here, which is, couldn't you have just kicked a drone out of the back of a plane and it could have done the mission without the Rangers in this, Operation Lightning story? It's an interesting question, right? And, I would answer you could, but the risk, given the sensitivity of this particular mission, trying to spoof the adversary, if you just needed to take out or, inject some kind of cyber payload into this, target in Antarctica, you could kick 100 drones out the back of a plane and it could take care of that. But to be able to use this misdirection, again, create kind of doubt downstream, within the kind of operational, elements of the PLA or up to the even higher levels, then you really do need to be able to have that judgment. And this is, I think, where I think we often overlook how really good, the human brain is. I mean, it's a computer in effect, right? I mean, that's why neural nets are based off of like how, the mysteries of our own brains, but we make really good sense in context quite quickly and faster, and more kind of precisely than some of the systems that are artificial out there. And in that really kind of high stakes moment, it feels like having a human or a team even better, on that X is going to get you to the outcome you need much better than just relying on machines, at least where we are today.
Sure, you're putting a battalion of Rangers into an objective with integrated air defense. You're damn right I want a human to look at that to make sure that tool has done what it's supposed to do before we launch a joint forcible entry.
Gil, so something you and August talked about earlier was this idea of operating in a decentralized manner, right? So the story features junior leaders exercising enormous initiative from afar, and you've got, this commander who expects Rangers to step in for their fallen comrades and assume, larger responsibilities kind of in real time. How do you think about mission command? And for the audience, mission command is just the idea of operating in a decentralized manner. But how do you think about mission command and risk tolerance in a contested environment where you may not be able to talk to your higher headquarters?
Yeah. We talked a lot. I'm going back in the Wayback Machine again, but we talked a lot in 10th Group just about, communicating. This is 2017 timeframe. When I was out there and talking about, that was back at the beginning of the, European Defense Initiative. We were 2.5 years out of the Russian invasion of Crimea. And so we were talking a lot about contested communications, and how we were going to communicate. And the more I thought about it, I realized, look, there's going to be at least 3 components to this. And in my mind, it's the 3 primary components. There's going to be a tech solution to a certain extent, right? You're gonna need some new technology to talk in a new way, right? There's gonna need to be some tactics, techniques, and procedures, solutions that we're gonna have to come up with. So, okay, we've got a new piece of kit. How do we use this piece of kit in a way that it's not going to compromise us? But then another big aspect of it is commanders' expectations, right? I mean, we raised generations of commanders in the Middle East that had, comprehensive knowledge of what was going on in the battle space. I mean, how many times did you hear the term air supremacy used during the GWOT? Never, because it wasn't even a thing, right? Nobody had an Air Force after like the first day, right? And so we never even talked about that. So we dominated every domain, I would argue, except for the human one, right? And so we didn't learn bad habits. We fought the way the war needed to be fought at the time, right? And we didn't waste our time sneaking off and make it secret communications when we could just blast everything we needed to. So we didn't do anything, that wasn't wrong. It was just, it's just no longer appropriate for the kind of fight we're going to get into. So, we have full confidence that the people we bring into Army Special Operations are capable of doing any mission we ask them to do, as long as we resource them appropriately beforehand to be equipped and trained to do the mission. That's really what it boils down to, right? You are not putting a 4-man ranger these guys didn't just do okay, we're going to go do a couple jumps at Fort Benning and, fly this, we got this new piece of kit. Let's fly that. We'll be high fives all around. Let's go. No, but where did they jump to test the thermal equipment? Where did they jump to make sure that the full color nods are not going to freeze up in sub-zero temperatures? Those are the kinds of things. And that's probably the biggest difference with the way we are expecting our formations to train. That's probably the biggest difference between now and how we trained during the GWOT, because the GWOT was dangerous. I mean, we lost a lot of great Americans during the GWOT. It was dangerous. It was combat and it was lethal. But there were a lot of aspects of it that weren't highly complicated because we were able to buy down so much risk by dominating so many of the domains. Now, a lot of these formations that are led by people who knew nothing but the GWOT, right? We're expecting formations to train for a much more lethal battlefield where we will not dominate the domains.
Great reminder that, success isn't magic. It's all the little things you did in the lead up to it that sets the conditions for success. I do want to be mindful of everyone's time, and I've only got a couple more questions left, but for the Future of War series, we do like to highlight change, but also continuity, right? What are the timeless aspects of military operations, leadership, human behavior that will remain constant? So I'll direct that question to August 1st, but I'd also like to hear from our other guests. What remains timeless?
I think the question of assessing risk and understanding at all different levels in an organization what's acceptable is one of the most crucial elements that, if you look again, I'm going to go back to the SOE and OSS era of special operations to today. We reframe that constantly based on how we perceive the threats at the strategic level to our nation, for example. And I think one of the most important things is acting as if today in 2026, really understanding the nature of warfare is changing. It's more cognitive. It's, global. It's, crossing the kinetic into the economic and the spectrum, and electronic. And so really being able to create cultures where people really actually thrive in the opportunity that risk creates. And that doesn't mean doing dumb and careless things, but rather understanding that gives you a lot more of an operating envelope to do things that are unexpected. And I think I said this on a prior podcast, but really, how do you create surprise? What is really the element in special operations or regular warfare of doing something truly novel and unexpected? Because we have more information than ever. We have kind of narratives about what, irregular warfare and SOF are supposed to be. So how do you do something unexpected? And I think that to me is one of the really important questions to keep asking, really every day.
That was wonderful. There was a foreign advisor that was helping his army, and he reported back to his folks. He goes, these Americans, man, I always feel obliged and I have to explain why we're going to do this and to what end effect of it. Well, that was von Steuben. You know what I mean? Like, American is going to be an American, and that's, so I guess it's what doesn't change is the spirit in that character. And that's why we still do land navigation, because that's a great way to test metal, problem solving, and all those things, to put yourselves in uncomfortable situations. And so our attributes are skills and behaviors that we assess, you'll see from 1955. Those things have really not shifted a lot. We'll change different words, but when you get down to the core of the human being, that's still what matters most. And we get sucker punched a lot. That happens when you're the big person on the block. That's going to happen to you. But our ability to get off the mat is unmatched. But yeah, it's constantly testing ourselves and those kinds of things to be ready.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to that. We've talked already just how we're in our headquarters. We're trying to balance the tension, the natural tension between continuing to pursue technological solutions that set conditions for our formations that will buy down risk, whether that's in the space domain, the cyber domain, the electronic warfare domain, we are going to continue to pursue capabilities in all of those arenas and more to try to continue to buy down risk to our formations. Because ultimately, yes, soft truth, number one, humans are more important than hardware, right? And we want all of the people that come into our formation, we owe it to them. We owe it to the mothers and fathers and the sisters and brothers and the wives and husbands of the American public that give us their most precious resource, which is their children. We owe it to all of them to ensure that every day that we come to work, we are thinking about what can we do to make our folks more successful, to buy down risk to the human beings that live within our formation.
To wrap up our shows, we always look at the implications of the piece of literature we're examining. And August, this is the end of a 4-story journey with our audience, and looking across all 4 vignettes to include today's short story. How should practitioners, policymakers, and academics think about the future of war?
I think being able to look at what's coming with both an unbounded sense of the possible, but not straying too far from the technical and human realities we know is really important. And it's very easy, especially when we have a lot of interest in, reforming and reframing the technologies that we all use in our everyday lives and how those apply to warfare, being able to really, truly understand what's real, what's vaporware, but also not overlooking the uncomfortable truths. Again, the rise of the cognitive domain would be one right there that doesn't necessarily fit the kind of modern conventional understanding of warfare. But when I look at the world we're in, I see, a very different world than I think a lot of others do. And so to me, that's a really important aspect when you're thinking about the future of war, is just both to be creative, but also, anchor yourself in the reality we live in.
Gil, final word to you, although I guess slightly more narrow in scope. How should USASOC and its constituent organizations think about the future of war?
It'll be a variation on August's theme. We are looking for people that are creative and audacious. They can't just be creative. They've got to be audacious. They've got to possess the baseline attributes, as I mentioned a minute ago, that we seek in all of our assessment and selection programs and our training pipelines. I think we owe them the investment in the future, the investment in technology, the investment in the capabilities, and an investment in their training and their opportunities, to include time, which we didn't talk about really today, but the future of warfare will require soldiers to spend more time getting ready, because in order to do the kinds of missions that are laid out in August's short story there, you can't just train, hey, we're going to add an extra day onto the training calendar. We're going to stay down at JRTC another 24 hours and we're going to knock this. No, you're not going to be ready, right? So we owe all of them that. I think we still require the same type people that have been fighting and winning the nation's wars for 251 years now, roughly. And those folks are still out there. We've got to create opportunities for them to better themselves and to provide for their families, and frankly, to find fulfillment in their role within the service.
I couldn't think of a better way to end a discussion on the future of war by talking about, the people. But for August, DW, and Gil, thanks for joining us on the Irregular Warfare Podcast. It was a pleasure to host you all.
Great. Thanks for having us. All right, August, we're looking forward to getting you back down.
Great to see you guys there. And Ben, thanks again for making this whole series happen.
That concludes our conversation with August Cole, Lieutenant General Gil Ferguson, and Command Sergeant Major David Waldo. But before we leave this discussion, we want to bring some of these ideas to life through storytelling and fiction. The story you're about to hear imagines a future conflict with China in 2039 and explores how small, distributed Army Special Operations forces might operate globally to disrupt an adversary's ability to sense and see, creating opportunities for the broader joint force. So what might that future actually look like? Let's find out. Here's Operation Lightning, professionally narrated by Patrick Kirchner.
Operation Lightning, written by Peter W. Singer and August Cole. Read by Patrick Kirchner. Over Antarctica, 1 June 2039, 1420 Zulu. Plunging toward the icy terrain of the frozen continent at more than 120 miles per hour, Master Sergeant Ahmed Yassin's vision began to blur. Just a few seconds earlier, he had let himself pause to take in the majesty of the sweeping expanse of snow, ice, and rock through his full-color night vision goggles. A swirling arc of emerald hung low over the horizon, a ribbon of green between the ridges and mountains and the starry night sky. He'd never seen anything like this on a jump, or any other time. It was, at a very human level, a deserved measure of reward for such a dangerous mission. "And that's what you got for thinking such thoughts," he silently reproached himself. Yassine blinked rapidly and realized it was not his actual vision that was going, so his oxygen mask was still working properly, but his field of view had a fuzzy edge to it that was closing in. Soon he was having trouble seeing the jump computer's inertial nav system readout on his chest rig. The altitude looked to be 13,000 feet AGL. Or was it 15,000? What he could see was the bright red wind chill reading on his thermal suit. Minus 180 degrees Fahrenheit. That was it. The even colder air above the cold below. There had been a faint trace of condensation on his full-face oxygen mask that he worried would freeze if it built up any further. In response, he had unconsciously loosened the oxygen mask seal with his jawline. This slight movement was enough to allow a gap of a few millimeters to allow the sub-freezing dry air in. After doing so, his eyes stung from the cold, but it allowed the glass to clear, and he could see again. Losing his field of view would have been disastrous during the jump's critical phase. The other 3 Army Rangers falling through the sky would be focused on their own spacing from one another and their own descents, not his. If they got through this, when they got through this, he'd have to decide if he would mention the issue. It could be a learning opportunity. Then he reconsidered it, given all the shit in turn they'd give him for such a rookie mistake amidst the biggest mission of their careers. No, that wasn't quite right, was it? Their mission, his commander had said, was going to enable other SOCOM units in Task Force Buster to get in the fight and potentially turn the tide of the conflict, which made their small unit mission the most important of not just their careers, but the entire war. In either case, if this was all that went wrong, then this operation might have even a sliver of a chance of success. 5 months into a war that was supposed to be quick and sharp, long odds were the norm. This mission, though, still felt like a stretch to Yassine, and they were only part of the way through a series of steps that had gotten more and more difficult. The number and mileage of the flights on this mission alone would surely have achieved the much-coveted imaginary platinum status frequent flyer account that Yassine jokingly kept with mission planners at the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Fort Liberty, Tampa, Panama, and then the final stop of the C-27 at a dust-choked makeshift airfield in southern Chile. The local regime was supposed to be turning a blind eye to their presence. But with the way the war was going, no one was taking it for granted that Beijing wasn't getting a daily report of all comings and goings by discreet American commandos. Hence, the C-27 had showily flown on to resupply an ISR detachment serving with the Royal Marines on the Falklands, supporting the effort to keep planned ships from breaking into the Atlantic. What an outside observer couldn't see was that 4 of its passengers had stayed behind in the hangar to be picked up that night by a stealthy MV-280G Valor that then dipped and weaved across the terrain before crossing over the Southern Ocean to refuel at the wind-whipped British Antarctic Research Facility at Rothera Point. Then the last flight, in perhaps more than one meaning. They'd crossed the icy continent to the Chinese-held zone around Princess Elizabeth Land, coming in via the black zone of no radar coverage around the South Pole for the halo drop. While special operators have a reputation as door kickers, Yassine knew the reality is they'd always prefer to try the unlocked back door. From the moment they had jumped from the Valor, there had been no radio communication between the 4 Rangers, who instead tracked one another with narrow-spectrum beacons visible only to them through their augmented night vision. Drawing a lobster-gloved hand in to secure the oxygen mask once more, Yassine flicked the beacon on again, signaling it was time for the diamond-shaped jump formation to break apart. Each ranger spun away and deployed their parachute canopies. With a jolt, Yassine's parachute, thankfully a faintly mottled white color providing proper camouflage rather than the usual light gray, opened. Even with just over 4,500 feet left in his descent, he looked around using a multispectral machine vision system to ensure he saw canopies from the other 3 Rangers as well as their cargo pallet. Reliable GPS was something from the pre-war days. When it did work, you couldn't be sure someone had not manipulated it. And in this business, trust was everything. One by one, the Rangers maneuvered their parachutes into a stack-like formation as they followed the autonomously guided pallet earthward. The icy ground below came closer and closer, and Yassine stilled his body for the same PLF he'd first done into a sawdust pit at the basic parachute course so many years before. Only this time, when his boots slammed into the concrete-like ice, he rolled, heard a crunch, and blacked out. Improvised airfield, undisclosed location, 1 June 2039, 1501 Zulu. Aboard the MC-17, callsign Diablo 22, the 45 Rangers and other Joint Special Operations personnel adjusted their equipment and tried to get comfortable for what the rumor mill had said was a 3-hour flight. A few opened rations, but seemed to have little appetite, as they stowed the pouches in cargo pockets or wedged them behind their seats. The jet's auxiliary power hummed, barely registered by the board commandos who had been waiting aboard the jets for hours now. The soft tone of an all-hands briefing pinged in the Rangers' headset aboard Diablo 22 and the other MC-17s. The colonel now in charge of Task Force Buster had recently taken command after the commander's plane disappeared during their repositioning to the forward air base. But the now former XO was well liked by the Rangers. He started his Army career as an enlisted infantry soldier and served with the regiment for almost his whole career, having threaded a fine line between advancing up the ranks while avoiding assignments that took him away from the operational side of things. Task Force Buster will depart in 60 mics for our target landing zone, Objective Miami, arriving on target at 1730 Zulu. On your mission computers, you'll see the objective's layout, defenses, and your chalk's role. But given the importance of this mission, I'm going to walk you all through the overall concept one last time. Your chalk leaders also have written orders, maps as backups, and backups upon backups. But I think we all know that each of you will have to be prepared to step in to take on others' roles. Unstated was the reason behind that likely need to fill in for a comrade. Targets don't get more important than this. We're inserting by a low-level static line jump at the objective. It is an active PLA airfield used by their PLAF Strategic Bomber Force and escort fighters, the very same ones that have been causing our Air Force and Navy brethren so much pain. And yes, somewhere on that base is the bomber that sank the USS Doris Miller, so they merit our special attention. Once on the ground, Alpha and Bravo will engage the base's perimeter defenses. Charlie will push on to the flight, armament, and fuel facilities, where you'll do what you do best. Fuck shit up. Laughter filled the plane, easing some of the tension, just as he'd hoped. Delta's objective will be the command center facility. The mission is to capture those systems and the personnel. If that is not feasible within the mission clock, destroy them. Once we secure the airfield, we will consolidate at the planned rally points and rapidly redeploy for defensive operations. Then we will hold until reinforcements arrive at approximately plus 12 hours. And yes, that is a lot to trust in. But the success of this mission is built entirely on trust. Trust that your training has prepared you for just this moment. Trust that our intelligence is right. Trust our aircrew to safely deliver us into harm's way. Trust a small group of fellow Rangers to open the door for us to go in right. And most of all, trust in each other. But I know I can trust all of you for one simple reason. He paused and tilted his ear as if needing to hear something before he could complete the briefing. The entire audience replied, "Rangers lead the way!" Antarctica, 1 June 2039, 1617 Zulu. "What's that phrase? Thank heaven for small miracles," said Staff Sergeant Rowan Thurm. Pawing through their gear wearing his oversized gloves and thermal jumpsuit, Yassine thought the 28-year-old Ranger looked like a drunken polar bear pillaging a trash pile. "Everything's safe and sound," Thurm said as he pulled out their gear from the cargo pallet and then turned to look at Yassine. "I'll take that any time over an itty-bitty broken limb in our least necessary team member." Yassine could move his left arm, but it hurt every time he did. The team's medical specialist, Sergeant Brandon Vetter, had already given him a couple of combo pea-sized stims and pain pills. The pain still burned, though, which meant it was likely a serious fracture. While the three of them organized the gear, the fourth team member, Corporal Aaron Crane, was caching their jump gear and the disassembled pallet in a nearby rock outcropping, picked out for just this purpose by a hyperspectral satellite scan of the area that had recreated it in 3 dimensions for them to examine during their long flight. Within a minute, the team was on the move. The mission clock was too tight to linger for Yassine to recover. Yet as they crossed the broken terrain of snow, ice, and rocks, they were careful not to commit the operational sin of breaking a sweat. Do that, and you would die. Badly. The next hours took them on a winding path in the shadow of an escarpment, whose cliff-like features reminded Yassine of the cliffs in the northern Catskills where he had grown up. Like the cache for their jump package, the route had been carefully planned out to evade detection, taking advantage of the scatter of broken terrain and dead zones in surveillance. The models, though, could only create the EW spectrum, not the deafening wind or the cold that wormed its way into their bones, or how the adrenaline of a jump made the long hike afterward more draining than any war game. When the team finally made it to the location for their hide site, they were wrecked. But perhaps as daunting was the scale of the target they were now face to face with. Zhongshan Station had started in 1989 as a handful of metal huts housing 25 researchers from the Polar Institute of China, conducting work in the marine, glaciological, geological, and atmospheric sciences. However, in 2023, Zhongshan had also become a ground station for space operations. While an international treaty prohibited military bases on the continent, the facility was built and run by China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation, the state-owned company that was also the regime's biggest maker of missiles. The workaround allowed China to follow the letter of the law, if not the intent, at least until the war. A field of radome-covered antennae now surrounded the original research facility, looking like an innocent Smurf village set in the snow. Yet Yassine and his teammates knew the stakes. Each dome beamed data and commands back and forth with a network of hundreds of spacecraft placed in orbit over the last decades, as China had moved past America in the space race. By being located in Antarctica, the complex allowed China's network of observation satellites to downlink more frequently than with stations at lower latitudes. Thus, their target was the linchpin of an arc of observation that put every Allied system under threat, running from here up through to the Indian and Pacific Oceans. To make matters worse, the polar station was also the location of the longest airfield on the entire continent, providing staging and refueling for PLA aircraft and drones to cover an arc running across the lower half of the southern hemisphere, reaching up into multiple oceans. And this made the Rangers' target not just the most important on the continent, but one of the most important in the global battle for control of the air, sea, and space. Improvised airfield, undisclosed location, 1 June 2039, 1701 Zulu. Subsonic speeds to around 400 miles per hour, resistance to artillery and missile strikes, and can even emit an EMP. No way you beat that. Private First Class Ralph Urich could barely be heard over the MC-17's turbine jet engines shifting to full power as it moved faster and faster down the makeshift airfield. The wartime modified C-17s had all sorts of improvements, from more efficient and powerful engines to added electronic warfare capabilities and tube-launched drone systems for both decoys and swarm attacks. But the inside was just as deafening as ever. "What the hell is an EMP going to do against Superman?" replied his assistant machine gunner, Private First Class Ramon Suarez. "Iron Man maybe, but Superman's got no electronic gear to take out. And 400 miles an hour? That's like 1/100th of how fast the Man of Steel can fly. I mean, he's literally faster than a speeding bullet." "Yeah, but that's about his size compared to Godzilla," yelled back Urich. "He's just too small to take the big guy out." The jet left the runway, the engines louder yet, drowning out Suarez's response in the cacophony. So he screamed louder and louder while mimicking with his arms how the fight between the two would play out. Unfortunately, this caught the attention of a third party regarding their conversation. "Seriously, R&R?" The sergeant in charge of their chalk considered the two young Rangers to be his biggest problem children, and so he only spoke to them in combination. "R&R, we're about to go into combat, first trying to penetrate an integrated air defense system, and then, if we're lucky enough to make it, to effect a combat jump onto a reinforced battalion of ground troops. And you two knuckleheads are arguing about Godzilla versus Superman? Get your heads on straight and focus." "Yes, Sergeant. Won't happen again, sir." The two soldiers had said their apologia so many times that it came in perfect unison. "I'm sure it will. Indeed, I hope for all our sakes that it will. In either case," their sergeant continued with a wicked grin, "you're wasting your time. King Kong would kick both their asses." Antarctica, 1 June 2039, 1941 Zulu. The ducted fan drone drifted slowly in a lazy zigzag flight across the snow, a mere 6 inches above the moonlit ground. The size of a small notebook, it had a white, fur-like covering designed to defeat machine vision counter-drone systems. The camouflage also insulated the device from the extreme Antarctic cold. To Yassine, though, it made the drone look like a flying snow cone. "How much further?" he hissed at Corporal Crane, tracking the drone's autonomous path from the Ranger's hide site. "We've only got another 90 seconds of flight time." "Another 150 meters, she whispered back. "To think we came all this way to backpack that itty-bitty thing in," said Vetter, anxiously watching over Crane's shoulder. "Why couldn't they give it more range in this cold?" "Any bigger and they'd notice it," replied Crane. "Plus, it doesn't need to be big to carry that payload. Zeros and ones literally weigh nothing." Moving hardly any faster than snow would drift in the air, the small drone bobbed and weaved, getting closer and closer to the car-sized square antenna mounted on the roof of the Zhongshan Station's sleek, slab-sided communication center. "It still makes me feel like a human pack mule for a robot," said Vetter. "I thought it was going to be the other way around." "Well, at least we still have a job then," replied Yassine. "I'm getting a signal," said Crane, as the drone crossed into the range of the local area network. "Accessing. We're in." "Activate," ordered Yassine. At that point, a code injection began to work its way into the data fusion processing systems for the PLA's Indo-Pacific space-based surveillance program. The injection was simple yet elegant. Rather than effecting a shutdown that would be immediately noticeable, it added 10 to any number in the network found to be located beside the Chinese symbols Gyeongli. En route to Objective Miami, 1 June 2039, 2035 Zulu. "Get ready! Get ready!" a jumpmaster bellowed. Urich groaned as the MC-17 pulled up in a steep climb that drove him and the rest of the Rangers into their bench seats with all the subtlety of a barroom gut punch. For the last hours, the formation of C-17s had flown close to wave-top height over an expanse of night-darkened sea that the Air Force pilots saw rendered cobalt blue by their full-color night vision goggles. Now they gained height to allow the Rangers to jump out of a perfectly good airplane. "This'll be one for the history books," thought Urich, "and I'm going to be in them." When he had joined up, Sims and Stims were pretty much all the youngster had cared about. Things changed for him during basic training after he met a group of visiting Ranger cadre. The Rangers didn't talk about the bots they used or their state-of-the-art close-quarters viz or how much range time they got. It was a history lesson, told like how Urich wished he'd been taught in high school. Things didn't happen to people in this telling. Instead, Rangers made things happen. Tonight was one of those nights. The plane then rapidly leveled off, and on either side, aircrew unlocked and heaved the doors upward on their tracks. As the Rangers all stood, Urich noticed some Rangers instinctively take a half-step forward, and others visibly tense. He gave a fist pound to Suarez, as much to reassure himself as his battle buddy. Then the green light came on. The next few moments were a blur as the Rangers began filing toward the door. Clacking snap hooks slid along steel cables as one by one the soldiers dropped into the night sky. And then Urich was out the door. The blast of air as he tumbled out of the MC-17 was a shock, but as much a shock was the black void around him. From everything the officers had told them about the enemy's air defenses, the air should have been filled with missiles arcing skyward towards them, followed by fiery explosions of their own planes being knocked from the sky. Instead, nothing. Or rather, nothing nearby. Off in the distance, perhaps 10 clicks away, Urich could see what looked like a fireworks show, with detonation followed by detonation. The enemy had certainly fired off their missiles, but into nothingness. Something or someone had messed with their targeting, making their systems think that the strike force was where it was not. Before he had time to process anything more, Urich saw the whiteness of the terrain below coming closer and closer. He then prepped his body, just like they had taught him back at Fort Liberty. As he landed, he thought about how the sawdust pit at basic parachute course was a near-perfect match to the sand here in the Pacific. Maybe even softer. An unopposed landing right in the middle of the PLA's most important South China Sea air base, Urich thought. Thank heavens for small miracles.